Now, to the problems of education in Nigeria, one of the issues that should be taking center stage in the country's election campaign. If you've been following the print media, you'll see that many of them have been republishing an order made by a federal high court in 2014, ordering the Nigerian government to apply uniform cut-off marks to all candidates seeking admission into federal government colleges, otherwise known as unity schools. The judge ruled that the admission inequality in such schools was unconstitutional. The lawsuit had been instituted by the human rights lawyer and former president of the Nigerian Bar Association, Dr. Olisa Agbakoba, challenging the different cut-off marks for different states based on the candidates' gender and regions of origin. He argued that the practice violates the fundamental rights of the candidates to freedom from discrimination, guaranteed by Section 42 of the 1999 Constitution. But though he won the argument, the court order is yet to be implemented because the case has been stuck in the appeals system for the past 6 years. So what's the background to this story, and what happens next? Well, to delve more deeply into this controversial issue, I'm joined now from Lagos by the former president of the Nigerian Bar Association and founder of one of Nigeria's foremost human rights groups, the Civil Liberties Organization, or CLO, Dr. Olisa Agbakoba, who is also, of course, a senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me ask you, first of all, 8 years ago, in 2014, you took the government to court for what you said were discriminatory cut-off marks in admissions into unity schools. Tell us more about that.
Yes, I did that, and the judgment came down on the 17th of December, 2014. Now, my grievance was captured by Section 42 of the Constitution that prohibits discrimination on grounds of gender, ethnicity, and I felt that my grandchildren who come from Anambra State would be prejudiced if they have to have a cutoff mark of 139 to get into a unity school. The next one would be Imo at 138, Lagos 133, and then the whole thing comes crashing down. Zamfara for females is 2, for males 4. In fact, in some northern states it's 0. You don't even have to pass. And I thought this was wrong, so I approached the court. And the answer offered by the Attorney General and the Minister for Education was that they were promoting federal character, which was very laughable because federal character has to do with employment, not education. And they were also promoting affirmative action. On both grounds, the court overruled them and held that I was right, and they have since appealed. So the appeal has been dragging for the last 6 years, and that's why nothing has been heard substantially, and I can't even enforce the judgment. So that's where we are with that case.
So that was the legal argument that you made in court to support your lawsuit. But let me just pick you up on that issue of federal character principle, which, as I'm sure you know better than I do, is enshrined in the Constitution, and which mandates the government to ensure balance in apportioning the dividends of democracy among Nigeria's diverse peoples. I mean, isn't that the consideration here?
No, it isn't, because that has to do with public office appointments. But this is simply education of kids. So they're completely different. It was a point that was made by the government, particularly the Minister of Education. But the judge didn't accept that argument at all.
So basically, every state in Nigeria has a different weighted pass mark for the entrance exam. Is that right?
Yes. Absolutely. And Anambra has the highest, as I said, at 138, followed by Imo at 137, Lagos at 133. Then it crashes right down to 0 for a lot of states in the north. Zamfara, I recall, is 2 for females and 4 for males. So there's an imbalance, complete imbalance. These are all kids going to the same schools, being required to have different weighted marks to get in. And I thought that was, not good for Nigeria's unity. And of course, there's a way out of all this. It's simply to devolve powers. I don't see what government is doing, as federal government is doing, in education in the first place. So if you have the possibility of devolving education to the states, then each state can set up its own guidelines and criteria, and I think there will be no problem. So whatever state wishes to have high marks for entry, that's good enough. If you wish to keep it, at 0 marks, that's your problem. So I think that this case really hits the point about, restructure and devolution of powers.
Yes, I want to
get to the point I expect, our president.
Right, I want to get to talk to that in a minute, but I just want to be clear that the nettlesome problem is that if you are, say, from the southwest or southeast and you can't afford to send your children to private school because you don't have the resources, your child then becomes doubly disadvantaged because you can't be sure that they'll get into a federal government school because of this unfair, these unfair cut-off marks.
Yes, that's correct. Absolutely.
So you won the case.
And that was the essence of the case.
Right, that was the essence of your case. And you won.
I did win.
Yes, you won the case, but the ruling has not been implemented. As you said, it's tied up in appeals.
And so there's an appeal.
These discriminatory practices that you say are in place are still persisting 8 years later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Year on year, they're still persistent. So I'm hoping that the appeals will be taken one day, maybe next year, and we can see what may become of the policy. But clearly the policy is discriminatory. If you say my grandkids from Anambra should score 140 to get into Unity School, but a kid from Zamfara would score 4, and a kid from Gombe will score 0. So they can just go in as they like. But kids from my own state would have the burden of having very high marks to get in. So that's not fair. And that's what Section 42 prohibits. No discrimination on grounds of ethnicity. So an Igbo guy scores 134 or 137 and gets disqualified. A Zamfara guy scores 4 and gets in. It doesn't promote Nigerian unity at all. It's very, very odd.
Yes, but if you want these schools to be federal unity schools, and the idea behind the schools is that they are sort of model schools for purposes of integrating the people into the school system, then shouldn't you give weighted averages to some communities to allow their members to get in? Because if you don't do that, I mean, Southerners are likely to take everything. But if you want to integrate these schools, and there are only about 109 or 110 of these schools out of over 29,000 schools in Nigeria, then you have to do it at these sort of select model schools, don't you?
No, but you can't violate the Constitution, can you? The Constitution makes very clear in Section 42 that it abolishes and prohibits discrimination. And it sets out criteria for deciding what is discriminatory practice. One is gender, another is religion, another is ethnicity. So I'm sorry if that is the effect, but the Constitution is superior to the education policy of the federal government that promotes, different cut-off marks. And clearly the judge was able to hold that the Constitution superseded the educational policy of the government in respect of different cut-off marks. But I think the problem can be solved really by the federal government getting out of primary and secondary education. That's the way to solve it. The simple way to solve it is just to say, all states do your educational policy, and then each state can decide what it wants to do. That's the way for me to go.
I mean, education largely speaking, is in the hands of the state governments, isn't it? I mean, these are select unity federal schools, and there's only 109 or 110 of them, but education, broadly speaking, is in the hands of the states, isn't it?
No, it isn't, because this is only secondary level. Educational policy is set by the federal government, and in some cases, the federal government has primary schools. It sets the educational policy across Nigeria, from primary to secondary to university. So the federal government controls educational policy 100%. The states simply draw from what the federal government does. So my argument is that the federal government should quit, the educational space and return all educational policy issues to the states. So the states can therefore determine what they want to do. So matters of common concern in particular areas can be formulated by states within their zones or individual states. That's the way I see it. But the bottom line of all this is no policy of government is allowed to be contrary to the Constitution, because the Constitution is, as you well know, superior and supreme. So my point is this policy...
Yeah, go on.
Yeah?
Go on.
No, I said the policy simply violates the Constitution.
Right. So what are the...
It violates the Constitution, that's my point.
Right, and that's a fundamental point, it has to be said. But what are the advantages of these unity schools? Are they better funded? Do they have better quality education? Better teachers? I mean, why do they seem to be so attractive? I understand that most of them are pretty wrecked, really, in terms of funding and quality.
Yes, well, you see, these unity schools come from the missionary schools around Nigeria. So they adopted the model, and also adopted the model of the former government colleges. So you remember King's College, Government College Ueli, Government College Umuahia, and then the federal government colleges. So that was the model. So I think in the beginning, it was probably a great idea, when in fact, you should recall that this was started by the military, not even the democratic governments. So at that time, it was to promote unity. And I don't recall that these weighted cutoff marks were in place. But as we drifted into what we call a democracy, even though I just call it a civilian government, all sorts of things came in. The policy became warped. People used it to put their kids in school. So there's a certain preference, a certain discrimination that people see of those kids that go to unity schools. And as you know, in the budget, they're very well funded. That's another problem too that I raised, but I didn't push it. Now, why should there be special schools? Are these kids who go there special? Is it fair when you have special schools funded by the government in a special way, and then other schools are not? Why don't you simply just allow the private sector, the NGOs, the churches, the missionaries to run the schools just like it was in the 60s? But my big point is that federal government has no business being in education. That's the big point I'm making.
Right.
They've got other things to worry about.
But is there merit in the argument that some states are educationally disadvantaged and others less so?
Absolutely, I know that. I went to school in the north, so I'm very familiar with the issues of educational policy. And I think that's the real problem. We can't say we have a national educational standard. Every state has its own challenges. So in the north, the Almajiri problem is huge. And when I was in school in the north, we had actually to do class 7. I did class 7. But in the south, it stopped at class 6. When I came from the north back into the south, I was downgraded to class 5 because the standards were so different. So the way to go is to allow each zone or state develop at its own speed, rather than to pull those states that are perhaps more advanced back to the level of those that are not. That would be unfair to those who are more advanced for historical reasons. So the only way to go, as I say, is federal government stay out of education.
Right, so you mentioned the fact that you think that in this context, perhaps restructuring is the answer, allowing each region to, in effect, develop at its own pace. Do you see room and opportunity for that kind of change with this upcoming presidential election?
I hope so. I would, if I were, a presidential candidate, make it a big issue. I would like, for instance, if there's a debate and I'm present, to ask the candidates, what exactly is your educational policy? What do you see the federal government doing vis-a-vis the states? If I were a presidential candidate, would simply announce that we're going to run a very lean federal government. We're going to keep all those things that are common to Nigerians within the purview of executive and legislative authority of the federal government, and then let the states do others. So we will devolve power, a lot of power, to the states. The states are not busy. They just run to Abuja every end of the month to collect their own allowances and do nothing. So the federal government's, it's in the federal government's interest to keep the states very busy. Education, health, a lot of things can be devolved so we can have an effective, lean government at the center, promoting the peace, order, and good government of Nigeria. That is the purpose of the federal government, not to be running primary or unity schools. How can that be the problem of the federal government when we have bigger macroeconomic issues, unemployment, no jobs, poverty? Those are the big issues that the federal government should tackle. Honestly, I feel very strongly about this, that we should have a president coming in, calling the leaders of Nigeria's sub-ethnic nationalities to a conference and decide what the federal government will do and what the states will do, and then pass a bill in the National Assembly so you can devolve powers. Let the federal government concentrate on developmental issues, the big issues, and the states will be given their appropriate legislative function. That's the only way we can break from this morass of poverty that faces Nigeria.
But I mean, some would certainly argue that one of the ways to get rid of poverty is through education. And if you don't give access to education
Yes.
to disadvantaged parts of the country, then you're simply deepening poverty.
Yes.
And the other point that you mentioned about a new leader coming in, I mean, are they actually, because obviously this is not due to, it's not going to be an executive order. They would have to galvanize the National Assembly to amend laws that are seen as discriminatory, the kind of laws that you're talking about. I mean, would that be something that in itself would have its own pitfalls?
No, absolutely. That would be, because let's all agree that we're not doing very well. Nigeria is doing poorly. So a new president will be confronted with very big issues. And one of the big issues would be around restructuring, or what I prefer to call devolution. And as I said earlier, the point will be made about who does what. And it's not about disadvantaging any group of Nigerians. It's about actually giving them access, but in a way that does not impede on the rights of others. So that if education were left to the states, then all states would have to fund their educational requirements and needs. So it doesn't in any way impede. In fact, in my view, it opens the access, because from the federal government educational budget, I'm sure they spend quite a bit on salaries, on logistics. I don't know what is the content of funding that actually goes to each child in a school. So just taking it back to the states will even make it less costly for the federal government, and more enrollments will occur. So there's a lot of advantage in having the states taking over education.
Right. So beyond sort of the cut-off marks, I mean, you're talking about educational reforms now. I mean, what do you see as the problems of education in Nigeria?
The first problem is the educational policy that is the exclusive preserve of the federal government is wrong. So that's number one. So it's got to go to the right government, that would be the states. And then second, there's a need to tell government that they can't do everything. If you look at the gold standard around the world, the private sector plays a very strong role. So in the UK, for instance, their educational policy is divided in two. So you have independent schools, very strongly emphasized, independent schools run by charities, NGOs, churches, private business people, and you have public schools. So the government in the UK understands that it cannot fund everything. So it gives the private sector or the independent schools a place to play a role. I mean, I remember before the war, the charities and the missionaries were everywhere. I went to Christ the King College in Enugu, in Onitsha. A lot of schools were funded and run by the missions. But because government came in 1970 and introduced this new policy of taking over everything, I remember, as you well remember, who were both in Enugu as East Central State people, the administrator of the time, the late Okpabi Asika, compulsory acquired all schools, and I knew that was a big mistake. And that mistake lives with us today. So that all the schools in Enugu, in Onitsha, became government schools, and very soon they couldn't fund it. And I'm happy to see that Peter Obi in Anambra returned the schools to the missionaries, and that improved the quality. So that's the sort of policy I think we need to see a president of Nigeria in 2023 pursue. He should realize that he can't do schooling. That's not a priority for him, because there are other actors. And that's why the private schools in Nigeria do very well. And I think that if private people understand that there's a space for them to come in, you'll be very surprised. Look at the best university in Nigeria. It's Afe Babalola, not Unilag, not Nsukka, not Ibadan. Afe Babalola, who only started 5 years ago. Because he's brought to the policy of running his university a private businessman sense. And we can see that across. But in the federal schools, of course, you know the issue about ASU. Federal government can't even pay ASU. And I think there's an alternative even for ASU to begin to pursue. Must the federal government own universities in the first place? Isn't it time to find a new formula? We've been going through strikes. When I was in the university in 1973, strikes were on. And this is how many years ago? Going to 50 years, we're still talking about strikes. Hasn't it occurred to people that we can look for feasible alternatives? Why should federal government own universities? I don't know why ASU hasn't thought about it. So in this way, you see that we have the possibility of a new Nigerian president thinking policy in new ways and achieving better results. I'm looking forward to the campaigns when they start and the issues that will, crystallize around the debates.
Well, there's an awful lot of food for thought there, and we always appreciate your assessment. And of course, I hope the presidential candidates are also listening. Dr. Olisa Agbakoba, founder of one of Nigeria's foremost human rights groups, the Civil Liberties Organization, former president of the Nigerian Bar Association, and senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you very much indeed.